Good morning. I guess I'm on. My name is Becky Looning, and I am the host of this Incarcerated Veterans Workshop this morning. We did a workshop last year on this topic titled War Comes Home, and it's a phenomenon known to accompany war that many veterans come home and find it difficult to reacclimate to normal culture, and some of them act out and get entangled with the criminal justice system. So today we have with us 3 veterans from 3 different generations who will present the knowledge and experience that they've had with this topic of incarcerated veterans. And I'm just going to do a quick introduction, and then each of them will speak in turn for about 10 minutes. And after that, we'll use that as a springboard for a larger conversation. So we'll be beginning this morning with Kyle RODGERS. Kyle is an Iraq veteran who served with an infantry Marine unit for 4 years, starting in 2002. Post-service, he went to school. He's earned an MA in criminal justice at the University of Las Vegas. And he's now in the process of earning a PhD in sociology, focusing on military and veteran culture. And he's following in the footsteps of his mentor, Bud Brown, who is the person through which we found Kyle, based in Oregon, and Kyle's originally from Oregon. He serves as an expert witness in trials of veterans who have committed very serious crimes. Sometimes that kind of testimony at sentencing can be the difference between a life and a death sentence. So he'll tell you more about that work, as well as other things he's done. He also has a project called the Bunker Project at the university, which is basically safe housing for veterans. Brock Hunter, our second panelist, is a private criminal defense lawyer based in Minneapolis. And I found him through a Veterans for Peace member in Minneapolis who happened to mention him when I told him I was putting this panel together. Brock is a veteran of the 1980s. He served at the DMZ in Korea and when tensions were very high. So, but he has become a specialist in defending veterans. He has gained some national notoriety in that field. One of his cases was cited by the US Supreme Court in a landmark decision, which addresses combat trauma in criminal sentencing. He has founded a project called the Veterans Defense Project in Minneapolis. He has authored a book, or is a lead editor and co-author of a book, The Attorney's Guide to Defending Veterans in Criminal Court, which Kyle told me he's used as a resource. He can share with you more of his specific experience. He's actually also briefed some of our presidential administrations, I mean the Obama and Trump administrations on, and the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs on the, I think, well, I'll let Brock speak more to that experience. Our third panelist, Wesley Hay, he's a Vietnam era veteran who served with the 82nd Airborne in Dominican Republic. And he has a wealth of life experience, which he will share with you. Currently, he's involved in a lot of different endeavors, very, very focused on helping veterans. He's a board member of Central Coast Center for Independent Living, which is about housing and resources for disabled people. And he's also a board member of William James Association, which brings creative programs in art and music and creative writing into prisons, which is a great resource for helping people as they're, you know, to become whole again. And he's also a member of the Monterey County Restorative Justice Commission. He has his own project also focused on developing a gated community for veterans rated 100% at the decommissioned Fort Ord in the Monterey Bay. Okay, so without further ado, let's bring Kyle on to begin the conversation. Kyle.
All right, hello everyone. Glad you're all here. Like Becky said, my name is Kyle RODGERS. I'm based out of Las Vegas right now. Let's see where I'll start. So I'll start with this, my personal background part that wasn't included in what Becky mentioned, is that 3 years after I got off of active duty, I ended up in the criminal justice system myself. I had some misdemeanor assault charges, and that got me involved in the system. And from there, that introduced me to some psychologists and things like that who did background stuff, and they determined PTSD and traumatic brain injury were part of the contributing factors, basically. And so that steered me into treatment, and from treatment, I ended up meeting Dr. Bud Brown. He's a Vietnam veteran who does expert witness testimony. He's worked with Brock Hunter, and he's the one who guided me kind of onto this path of looking more broadly at the veterans who end up in the incarcerated or in the criminal justice system. You know, I remember when I got arrested and I went to jail, and I remember being very surprised about how many veterans I actually met behind bars versus, you know, how rare it was I would meet another veteran when I was out in the civilian community. And that was kind of my first like aha moment of like, you know, there's something going on here. Like there shouldn't be this many veterans in here. You know, I shouldn't be meeting them here. I should be meeting them at the American Legion or the VFW or something like that, or here at VFP. Is what I had in mind. You know, I was still very, drank a lot of Kool-Aid, I guess, was very like supportive of, you know, my wartime experience. Just felt like everything was kind of justified in some way. You know, didn't really understand how, because I'm just this, you know, lowly enlisted guy. But somehow there must have been some justification, and just over time, and especially once getting to this point of the criminal justice part, was like, wait a minute, this felt like kind of an ultimate betrayal of where, you know, here are people who are at their sickest point, or, you know, they're most suffering, and now that point of suffering has gotten to the point where they've harmed somebody else in some way, maybe, and the way of responding to that is just to punish them and lock them up. And I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So it just kind of steered me onto this different path of thinking of, you know, starting to question war, and kind of how I ended up here at a Veterans for Peace conference. So anyway, so from there, after meeting Dr. Bud Brown, he's the one who kind of took my thing, and he said, you know, you have this background, you know, you've been locked up, and now you're studying criminal justice stuff and sociology and culture, and you know, how do you apply that, or where do you go with that? And you know, and so he started telling me about what he does in expert witness testimony and helping out in veteran criminal cases, and he told me, like, you know, basically he was looking for someone to take over, and you know, he's older and wanting to retire and that kind of thing, and so he said, you know, if you're willing to go all the way through a PhD, nobody's ever even gone to college in my family, by the way, you know, then we can show you on this path. And okay, so I started on this PhD track, and now I'm in the second year of my PhD program at UNLV, and so I focused my master's on veteran treatment courts was one of the things, and then with him, like, his thing is mostly focused on like the higher level crimes, the murder and things like that, capital offenses, and those things just don't end up in veteran treatment court. You're not gonna get into a diversionary program, you know, for a serious offense like that. And so he's like, you know, unfortunately with veterans, you know, our thing that affects us is violence. You know, it's bringing that violence of war back home with us, and kind of spilling that out into our society that we're in. And so the crimes that we end up with aren't usually the type of crimes that would end up in a veteran treatment court. So you still end up with a whole lot of people that kind of funnel into the criminal justice system, regardless of whether there's a treatment court or not available. So that's kind of the focus of what we're looking at, is more on those who end up outside of the veteran treatment courts. See where we're at on time. So anyway, so I did that. I looked at the veteran treatment courts, realized there's just not enough of them for the amount of veterans that are out there. Like if they ran all the veteran treatment courts at full capacity and tried to service as many veterans as possible, basically, they would really only reach about 5% of the incarcerated veteran population. So there's just not enough of them. It's pretty much the same thing as any other treatment court kind of deal. So I think I'll just kind of conclude here. Without getting too much, I want to kind of get into the questions and see what people have to say. But the conclusion for me was basically that the criminality stemmed from war. Like when military veterans ended up committing crimes, like I saw it tied to war. Like I saw like through my research, looking at the history of war over a long time. All the way back to Mesopotamia. Writings from Mesopotamia, they've talked about issues of veterans, not necessarily getting incarcerated back then, but at least talking about issues from war and things like that. And so this stuff's not new. And I feel like I'm rambling. And it's not new. And and anyway, that's what I was going to say. So as we're looking back at, looking all the way back through history and looking like as we have, after there's a war, and then looking at the society right after that, it's always kind of this spike in crime. And you can really see that here in the United States, where we were pretty good about keeping records on stuff. And so like you can go back to the Revolutionary War and you can see like this huge spike in horse thievery and things like that. And a lot of veterans from the Revolutionary War ended up behind bars. The reformatory movement, spawned after the Civil War, where they saw all these former soldiers, Union and Confederate both, filling up all the prisons and stuff. And they said, well, this isn't right. We can't. These guys fought for us. They got the whole country that we have now, and yet there's these terrible things happening, and so now we're locking them up. So they tried to reform them. So this whole reformatory thing came about from that. And World War II, similar stuff. So Vietnam, and now with Iraq, we're seeing similar stuff. And it bleeds over. This would kind of lead over to Brock, where a lot of this stuff kind of bleeds over to active duty too. That is not necessarily this dividing line that you're in the military and you're serving and everything's great, and then you get out and it's the civilian culture that creates the problems. It's there's stuff that happens on active duty as well. And we're seeing that, I think, lately with just in the last few weeks, like with the Fort Hood bodies that have been found. There were a couple, Vanessa Gillen, and Ian, not sure how to say her last name. And then we got Fort Riley, just another master sergeant that was found. So there's lots of different stuff where this stuff bleeds over. And for me, it was, looking at like, wow, all this stuff like ties directly to the combat experience, and I'm like, if the whole point of war to me, like when I participated in it, was that we were gonna, was to get to peace, eventually. Was that, we're gonna stop bad people from harming the good people, and this whole fantasy, and realizing after getting out that, wow, that we're actually creating more problems. That, like now that these war fighters, who, especially the ones who are struggling or can't turn that stuff off, or affected by the culture where, you're taught, now you're indoctrinated into a culture where, that your way of dealing with problems is violence. And so now you go back out to a civilian culture where to respond to problems or issues with violence now leads to, assault charges and murder and things like that. So, it's just huge ripple effect. And so that's basically where I kind of switched, I guess, from, being super patriotic and proud of my service and, and that kind of stuff, to like really starting to question, like, is this really the best way to solve conflict or solve our problems, or that kind of thing? Or are we really like, just the whole Veterans for Peace movement, basically, like, are we really getting the best way here? So, and the answer for me was no. That no, like it's not justified to, most of the time, especially with Iraq and stuff like that. I didn't feel it was. So I don't know. I think that's for each person to share their own philosophy on that, I guess, on where war for them is justified or not. And for us, I'm pretty sure we all kind of are on the same page that it's not. But that's pretty much where I'm at. I feel like I'm just kind of rambling now, so I'll just pass it off to Brock Hunter. I know he's got a pretty well prepared presentation.
I don't know how well prepared I am, but I'll do my best, Kyle. So I'm Brock Hunter. As Becky noted, I am a criminal defense attorney based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, but I have a practice that spans all over the country. And I, like Kyle and his mentor, Bud Brown, consult on a lot of cases around the country, particularly more serious ones in which veterans have committed murders and other serious crimes and are facing life in prison, or unfortunately sometimes the death penalty. My journey started in the 1980s, as Becky noted. I was an Army cavalry scout stationed on the DMZ in Korea at the very tail end of the Cold War. And I never got shot at, and I never had to shoot anyone, unlike a lot of the veterans that I'm sure are tuned in today. But it was close enough to, I think, sear itself into my experience. The closest we came to war was June of 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and the Tiananmen Square massacre happened in Beijing, China, just a few hundred miles away. The Cold War came really close to becoming hot on the Korean Peninsula, and 1.6 million North Koreans military had massed along the DMZ, prepared to invade, and we were spun up and ready to go to war for a period of several weeks straight. And I was in the division's reconnaissance squadron, and we were going to be the very first to go into the fray. And we were told in no uncertain terms that if the war kicked off, we were not expected to last more than about 24 hours. So that experience of facing that and accepting our own death, though the fighting never came, definitely had an impact on us. And as I got out of the military a year or so later and came home and started as a freshman in college, those experiences followed me. And I had a period of difficult readjustment back to civilian life. Did a lot of stupid stuff, as I always say, that could have landed me in a lot of trouble and prevented me from eventually practicing law had I been caught, frankly. So those were my experiences that led me, I think, into this work. And flash forward a few years, I finished college, law school, and I'm finding myself in the late 90s as a public defender in the Minnesota court system. And almost immediately, I recognized how many veterans we had coming through the criminal courts in Minnesota. And at that time, it was primarily Vietnam vets. And in talking to them, I came to realize that many of them had been cycling through the criminal justice system on a regular basis ever since they had come home 30 plus years before. Many of them were still living their combat experiences as if they had happened yesterday. And I remember thinking at the time that it made anecdotal sense to me, though I didn't have the knowledge I do now about PTSD and its ties to criminal behavior. I remember thinking that my experiences followed me home, and I hadn't experienced even a fraction of what many of these veterans had experienced in Vietnam. And it made sense to me that many of them would still be struggling with it, and that those struggles could lead them into intersecting with the criminal justice system. So those were the beginnings for me. And then as time went on, of course, 9/11 happened, and we have now deployed another generation of young men and women overseas to fight and sacrifice like we haven't since the Vietnam era. And we've been at these wars now for 18 plus years, longest wars in our country's history, with one of the smallest fighting forces we fielded per capita in our country's history. And we are recycling troops into combat over and over and over again in a way that we've never done before. And so my concern over those issues has continued to keep me engaged in this. And as my criminal practice has evolved, it has become very heavily centric on representing veterans in the criminal court system and making sure that their military service and resulting combat trauma is properly considered, either at the trial phase potentially, and if not at the sentencing phase, so that they get as much justice as possible. I've also spent a lot of time advocating outside of the courtroom for changes in the criminal justice system as a whole, to try to make sure that we do a better job with this generation of veterans than we did in the past. And through that, co-founded the Veterans Defense Project, this public policy, education, and advocacy organization that spends a lot of time educating the courts and getting them to set up things like veterans courts and veteran sentencing statutes across the country. As Becky noted, we also published the book Defending Veterans in Criminal Court, that serves as a resource for defense attorneys and other criminal justice professionals who work with veterans around the country. And in the process of all that, have done a very deep dive into the history of these things, like Kyle referenced. And I think it is critically important to understand that the veterans that we see coming home today, having contact with the criminal justice system, are hardly anything new. And a big part of the message that we take in our advocacy through the Veterans Defense Project around the country is that veterans, for as long as there have been war, veterans have come home and brought their war home with them, and in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder and other associated conditions. And that a significant portion of those veterans have acted out against their own communities, the same communities that they have risked their lives to protect. They come home and undiagnosed and untreated, often act out against those same communities and find themselves in the justice system, facing the punishment of that same society that deployed them in a very dark, ironic way. Among the statistics that I often cite too is that of the 3 million or so Americans who served in Vietnam, 1.5 million suffered long-term psychological issues related to their service. Depending on how you define the injury, it ranges from 1 million, which is around a third suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and up to a half suffer on other related psychological conditions. And according to a study done by the VA in the mid-1980s, half of the veterans that was treating for post-traumatic stress disorder by around a decade after the Vietnam War ended, half of them had had some criminal justice contact. Half of them had been arrested at least once. The same study found that a little over a third had been arrested 2 or more times, and nearly 12% convicted of felonies in just the first decade after the war. And these are statistics that are way, way outside of the civilian norms. Kyle also mentioned historical data going back even further. The Civil War is rich with information on this. The prisons in the United States filled up with veterans fresh off of the battlefields during the Civil War. In 1865, the year that the ceasefire was entered, prisons filled up. The Pennsylvania State Prison reported that 90% of the prisoners that it was currently housing had just come off of the battlefield. And in the words of the warden, most in poor physical condition and 9/10 incapacitated and demoralized by the war. And as Kyle noted, the first prison reform movement started in the years after the Civil War, as Americans began for the first time to be concerned about the way we were treating our prisoners, because so many of them were our fathers and brothers and husbands who had been sent off to fight and would not have been in prison but for the fact that they had served and were struggling with post-traumatic stress. We also talk about the wild, it was veterans of the Civil War that put the wild in the Wild West, and almost all of the outlaws and gunfighters that we grew up hearing about, it turns out were veterans of the Civil War, and many of them very likely struggling from untreated combat trauma. And we see the same cycle repeating itself after World War I and World War II, all the way up through Vietnam. It's just been a common side effect of war. And more recently, my research has been focused on political extremist movements that veterans have come back and joined after various wars. And the post-Vietnam era is very heavily researched in this area. And we see Vietnam vets having returned from the war with untreated trauma gravitating into right-wing groups and left-wing groups following Vietnam. The White Power movement, the renewed Ku Klux Klan, all were revived and empowered with Vietnam vets. And groups on the left, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, the Symbionese Liberation Army, all had key members who were Vietnam veterans who came back and brought their warfound skills back into these groups and helped drive the extremism. And I think we're seeing a pattern emerging on that front again, with various groups of veterans from the current conflicts coming back and gravitating into these groups on the right and left. And one of the things that we advocate for in starting veterans courts and taking a more therapeutic approach to veterans who are coming into the system is that this isn't just good for the veterans and good for their communities, but also good for our country as a whole, to make sure that we don't have folks feeding into this kind of extremism that's going to drive our country further and further apart. Lots and lots of things that we can talk about digging down into the details of this, but I think I've used up my time, and I'll go ahead and pass things off to Wesley.
Good morning, Wesley here. Kyle and Brock has brought much information to veterans like myself who came home lost and dark. When I came home, I didn't feel that I was able to participate in the norm. I sought a group that were more consistent with the violence that I experienced. I served with the 82nd Airborne Division. Our first deployment since World War II was to the Dominican Republic, where not many know about it. It's forgotten. Nevertheless, the residues of that dark experience still reside in me at the age of 75. Through my choices, I committed murder, and I served 30 years in prison. Since I've been home, something that came to mind while I was in prison was to assist veterans, to do my part in assisting them not to go down the path that I chose. Since I've been home, I'm a certified peer support specialist. I'm really involved in the community, as Becky showed and stated. I'm on 2 boards and 1 commission. Presently, I'm also a mentor for the Veterans Treatment Court. I am what they call boots on the ground. I move around the Monterey area, assisting veterans in housing, listening to their stories, understanding through my own experience what it's like to come home and not finding a place, not feeling the camaraderie that exists in the military, especially in a combat scenario where life and death draws even men who were prejudiced in their own setting, in their own cities, and became brothers. Today, it is my vision, and I'm working towards it as we speak, to develop a 100-unit gated community for veterans rated at 100%. Here in Monterey County, there's a no control rent system that uses up half of the little monies that we get from the VA. So I have taken a step to be an example, to experience what it's like to live a normal life, even though we're economically challenged. I was afforded the opportunity to buy a condo at 50% market rate because of my income. And my involvement with vets is my own experience. Brock would have been ideal when I got sentenced to 31 years to life. Kyle's advocacy, these things were non-existent in the 80s, in the very late 79, 80s. I saw fellow Vietnam era vets, combat vets in prison. The history is clear. We need to not rely solely on the VA, but become a part of the solution to assist our young brothers and sisters coming home, dark, PTSD, MST, TBI. You know, we defended this country. We gave our lives. We watched our comrades fall. And we come home to a society that shares platitude. Thank you for your service. But I say to you today, what are you doing for the vets? 22 plus are dying a day, committing suicide. Many veteran women with children are homeless. Veteran men choosing to live in what they call the bush, outside city norms. I have experienced assisting a couple of vets into the Veteran Transitional Center, and they were unable to adjust. Though the opportunities were available psychologically, they were not able to participate in the norm. Kyle and Brock has spoken historically. This is still going on. We need to be more participant in assisting our veterans who put their lives on the line. I don't want to take up too much time because I know there are many, many, many questions. Veterans incarcerated is a very, very, very important issue that we all need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Wesley. Thank you, Brock. Thank you, Kyle. We do have a number of questions that have come through the Q&A, and a couple of them have to do with reintegration. Let me read a couple of those out. It says, does the military offer any training on reintegration into civilian life? And that question came from Harold Apple. He says, for example, being trained to kill as your duty, sent home, now killing is wrong. I can't imagine that the military provides guidance on that. But, and then another question is, are there examples of successes from using the best practices in any follow-up programs for veterans? What do the panelists think is the priority need for veterans exiting active duty? Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Wes.
Okay, you have to unmute yourself, Wesley.
In order to assess veterans who have committed the most heinous crimes, we need to have some health program specifically for these veterans. We should not wait till these men and women come out of prison after 20 plus years to assist them. We need to assist the vets while they're in there supposedly being rehabilitated. In order to be rehabilitated, you need to know what the problem is. Where did it begin? And we don't have that in prison. I hope that answered that question.
Brock.
So I'll tie two of the answer two questions, I guess, in one. So there was another question is, do military training predispose veterans to violence or abusive attitudes in civilian life? And then is there any reintegration training essentially to deprogram that, I guess is the way I interpret that the earlier question. I think there's plenty of research out there that supports the idea that military training, particularly the intense combat training that infantry and special operations and other types of folks who are engaged in direct combat with others, I think there is evidence that supports that it predisposes those to post-service violence, particularly when those individuals are coming home with undiagnosed or untreated mental health issues and are self-medicating with alcohol or drugs. I think that programming is very much there, and we see it in case after case where veterans react instinctively with violence to a perceived problem. As I often say, you know, the whole adage, if the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And for a lot of the combat vets that we work with in the courts, they're coming out of service with a big hammer in their toolbox, and that's about it. And so when confronted with adversarial situations, threatening situations, even situations they perceive to be threatening that may not actually be, they instinctively fall back on violent behavior. And in speaking about these, I always am also careful to educate our criminal justice professional audiences to understand that military training as it exists today is not what our grandfathers and great-grandfathers went through. And in fact, there's a great deal of studies written up on how military training has evolved significantly, particularly since World War II. And it's become much more scientific, and the use of Skinnerian conditioning and operant conditioning to decondition people to the idea of killing and then to make reactions to threats instinctive have had a big impact. And then of course, with our current generation of veterans, they haven't just been trained to this cutting edge, but often deployed over and over and over again in a way that we've never done any other generation to hone those skills on the battlefields across the world. I think it's inevitable that many of these folks bring these skills and instincts home with them, and it lands them into trouble. And no, I don't think that there is a significant amount of deprogramming going on as these folks are leaving the military. And in fact, I see veterans courts and other programs like it as filling that gap. We're dealing, you know, in those courts with veterans who are coming home and acting out in various ways, and using the leverage of the criminal justice system to get them into programming that they might not otherwise have sought out on their own, to get help and nip this issue in the bud, hopefully, before their behavior escalates and they find themselves facing much more serious charges where veterans courts are not an option. Definitely curious to hear what Kyle has to say.
Yeah, I like all these questions. So I'll try to touch on Harold's questions. We got, does the military offer training or reintegration? So a little bit. They have, a TAPS program, transition assistance program. When you get out, that's really limited. And then they have some resiliency training that they do. They have, when you come back from deployment, they have like a short week or two, like a cool down kind of thing. I can't remember what they call it, but they have different names for their different programs for different branches. Basically, it's like a cool down, go through some mental health evaluations and that kind of thing. The problem with that kind of stuff, though, is that everyone kind of knows that if you answer yes to any sort of mental health question, that now you're going to be held longer to go do some sort of treatment for that thing that you answered yes to. So the easiest, and your focus when you get home from war is, I want to go home. I want to go relax. I'm not trying to stay around, hang around on base longer than I need to. That kind of thing. Same thing with the transition stuff. When you're getting out of the military and going to join the civilian community, it's, I'm just focused on, I just want to get out of the military. I'm focused on beginning my next life. So all that stuff is kind of trivial. It's like a check in the box, kind of sitting in a safety brief kind of thing. So it doesn't have a whole lot of effect, unfortunately, with the reintegration stuff that happens while you're still in the military. So that kind of, for me, falls into like with this other question, see where to go. Other examples of successes using best practices. So to me, like the best practices are, and then he says, what do you think a priority need for veterans exiting active duty? I think a focus on reincarceration is the major key there, that transition going from military culture to the civilian culture. And that hardest part is really like what was it, Gregory's question, does military training predispose violent, abusive attitudes? And, and addressing that, I think, is one of the hardest parts. Just saying, acknowledging that, yes, that by me participating in boot camp, just boot camp alone even, where that's where most of that, scientific indoctrination happens. I may be more predisposed to act out violently than somebody else who hasn't gone through that same type of training. And that requires kind of everybody in the military to look at themselves and realize that, wow, I might have more criminal propensity than somebody else. And that requires a lot of self-reflection, a lot of, that kind of stuff. So that's hard to do. So, I mean, just showing up to a presentation like this kind of takes a little bit of that, like being open-minded enough to address this issue, because I think kind of the easiest way to deal with veterans in the criminal justice system is just kind of kick them under the rug and say, well, those were the people who were going to end up in criminal justice system anyway. Those were the bad apples. They were bad seeds. They were defective from the beginning. These are the kind of the arguments against really paying any attention to this issue or acknowledging the military's influence. This kind of it's an easy way to dismiss the military influence and say, well, I didn't have any influence. It's because he was abused when he was a child. It's because she led paint chips when she was little. And there's all kinds of different explanations for criminality that can kind of fall over. So where's the other one? Well, the other one, Elizabeth's question: are there examples of successes using best practices? So Dr. Brown, he started this project, the Bunker Project, as a nonprofit, and he ended up passing it off to me as to be on the board. And so I ended up starting a house that's close to campus, and this is where I've kind of taken these best practices, ideas, and trying to implement them, and on a small scale for now. So I bought a house and I use it for a transition, basically trying to transition people, veterans, from wherever they're at. So ideally, I was trying to connect with people just as they're getting off of active duty, as kind of like a prevention effort. And so they get off active duty and come to a Bunker Project house, which next to a campus. And so then they've got some peer support in the house. They don't have to be on campus, in the dorms, people that are younger with them that they don't connect with and end up dropping out, or that kind of stuff. So a lot of that is based on, you know, a lot of psychological, there's a lot of psychological research that kind of goes into the, like that kind of idea of peer support, peer mentorship. There's a house manager who I'm serving in that role for right now. And, you know, so the other veterans can come to me and kind of ask me for guidance or kind of that kind of stuff. You know, I manage the house and just kind of make sure the bills get paid and stuff. But that's kind of one of my ideas of best practices. But I think ultimately, though, the thing is that, you know, that this stuff has like lifelong effect. You know, we've still got, you know, you've got Vietnam veterans, you know, World War II veterans, you know, who still to this day are just going into treatment for the first time, you know, or just starting to open up about stuff. You know, and a lot of people never open up about stuff. You know, they'll, you know, with the suicide rate as high as it is, you know, we see that people are often willing to put a bullet in their head before they're willing to talk to anybody else about this stuff. So I think it's really like just a huge comprehensive effort. The thing I see a lot is collaborations as being key. So it's, you know, this organization might do really well with horse therapy. This one might do really well with housing. This one does well with schooling. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to do is get connected into collaborations and find how we can refer to each other. So, you know, so I might be able to offer some housing, but if somebody's having a real mental health breakdown, okay, well, maybe now we need to go over, you know, over here and let's go to this veteran retreat or, you know, something like that, some kind of inpatient thing. I mean, there's all kinds of different stuff. So I think that's one of the promising things, that there is a lot of stuff available today that there wasn't before. So I think that's all I got on those questions. Thanks.
And I could tag team on that a little bit and tie it in, I guess, with a couple of other questions that have popped up. One of the honors I get, I guess, in working as I do with more serious cases as well as lower level cases going into veterans courts is to see some success stories. As Kyle noted, when a veteran is charged with murder, the options become much more limited. You're really triaging and trying to avoid the very worst of the consequences they could face. But if they're going off to prison, they're generally not getting a lot of help. And one question that popped up is do they get any treatment in prison? And that's going to vary from state to state and prison to prison as to what kind of treatment's available. And I'm sure Wesley can speak to his experiences inside as to what was available, but it generally isn't good in my experience. But if they're not going to prison, I could talk all day about success stories that we've had with veterans who have gotten a second chance in the criminal court system in exchange for their commitment to be accountable for themselves and their behavior and to go to treatment and to gain sobriety and to get some tools to deal with their combat trauma and really amazingly turn their lives around. Kyle made mention of all these other resources that are available. And one of the nice things about veterans courts when they're really done well is that they don't just engage veterans in the local VA, but all of these other nonprofits that are available in their community and across the country that they probably aren't even aware of in many cases, of resources that they would not have sought out on their own, wouldn't have known about, but are connected up with through the courts. And there is all kinds of great stuff happening out there and stuff that's available for veterans who are interested in getting engaged. And the other thing I would quick throw in there is that beyond just purely therapeutic resources, I think it's really important that veterans who are coming through the court system and are getting psychological, medical type of help also find ways to engage in their own communities and find ways to give back. I often will talk to my clients and say, okay, you've graduated from the program at the VA, you've got your center of gravity back underneath you. Now you need to find a new mission in life. So many of the folks that I see struggling are not just struggling from untreated trauma, but struggling from a lack of sense of purpose and mission in life. And so I'll tell them, I'll say, you know, the military handed you mission and purpose on a silver platter and kind of spoiled you. And you've got to go out and find something now on your own to be engaged in. But if you find something that you care about and a way to give back to your community help other veterans is often one of the routes that they go. It will be helpful to you in your own ongoing recovery in life. And veterans that I've known who really have thrived post-war experience all are people who have found a new mission and are given back in some way.
Yeah, that's something that I noticed, Brock, too, in putting this panel together last year. You know, realizing that Kyle and Wesley were both veterans who were giving back to other veterans and helping. And when I discovered you, the man who told me about you also mentioned in the same breath this Hector Castillo, who had long military experience, very heavy combat experience, and had a flashback experience where he was, you know, woke up and found himself surrounded by police and, you know, in a situation that then got him into the criminal justice.
I'm happy to tell Hector's story here really quick. I think it is very instructive to everything we're talking about. Hector is a very close friend of mine and a partner in this work. So yeah, Hector was an Army Ranger and special operator who did 13 deployments over the course of an 18-year military career. And as you noted, Becky, found himself in a dissociative state in which he believed that he was overseas on an operation and that he was making contact with enemy combatants. In fact, he was on the front lawn of his house and he was interacting with police officers who were arriving on the scene, and came very, very close to getting shot and killed that night. Unfortunately, came out of his dissociative episode in time to realize where he was and to put down his guns and give up to the police. Still was charged with multiple crimes and had to get through the criminal justice system, but was given a chance to avoid a serious conviction and got help through the VA and otherwise. And what's really remarkable about his story, I think, is not just that he came out of that and turned himself around and got help, but that he then went on to serve an additional deployment overseas and earned a Bronze Star for his leadership on that last deployment, and then left the service and went back to school and is now a licensed therapist, master's degree level social worker, specializing in treating folks with post-traumatic stress disorder, many of them veterans, but also a fair number of law enforcement. And in fact, some law enforcement from the very department that arrested him years ago in his standoff with the police. He has a very good working relationship with that department and provides therapy care to officers who are dealing with trauma of their own. So it is quite a full circle story that he's gone through, and an example of, I think, what is possible for veterans if they are given a chance to get help and turn their lives around. They can be an amazing resource in their own community.
Now, someone in the Q&A brought up the topic of police and the number of veterans who become police officers post-service, and that may have something to do with some of the excessive force incidents that have often targeted communities of color. So can one of you speak to those? Are there some statistics or knowledge that you've gained in looking at that particular issue? Kyle or Brock? Or...
Speaking from my own experience, Blacks, whether military or civilians, normally, and you can correct me, Brock, because of lack of representation, I wish I had Brock when I went through, because the attorneys are telling me now that my combat experience was never raised in prison to speak to that experience denied me parole numerous times. And I learned I am basically saying to them, I am violent and I'm not going to change. So in prison, veterans, and I can't get this across, let's not wait till the veteran gets out of prison after 2 decades to assist, to take them through some programming. It's good that the young men that are coming back are getting this assistance. And as Kyle clearly said, the assistance is of no value because their focus is getting out. So whatever they need to say yes to, that's what they're going to do. So on both levels, coming back from combat, coming out of prison, the issue is not being addressed. Now, there is a small percentage of men who have endured extreme PTSD that by the grace of God were able to reintegrate. And what the name of that game is, boredom is the enemy. So most veterans that want to change, get involved, and they stay busy. And they stay busy because this takes the place of all the stuff that they don't want to acknowledge. There are cases where men like Kyle, myself, have come home, reintegrated, doing great stuff, and a trigger occurred, and that person committed suicide. So it's a very serious situation dealing with our brothers and sisters that are coming back from combat into prison or just coming back from combat. As Brock and Kyle clearly stated, you got guys from the Korean conflict are still messed up, you know, and then you have the other part, distrust. You know, we all have trust issues, you know, but I could go on my part, on my own experience. You know, that's why I leave the floor to Brock and Kyle, because they have the statistics that will support what's going on. Thank you.
I am interested in hearing what has worked for you veterans who have had to face that, the violence inside yourself and turn that around somehow. Like what has worked for you in your recovery? But if anybody wants to answer the question about police or about, there's another question that came up about domestic violence that I think we should touch on in this discussion.
I'm not aware of any studies that show the percentage of police officers who are returning veterans. Anecdotally, I think it's a significant number, obviously, and not just today, but historically. And I think if a police officer is a combat veteran who's come home with untreated trauma and they're not getting any help, they're much more likely to have issues on the job. But I'd also note that police officers, even who are not military veterans, I think very often manifest post-traumatic stress from their experiences on the street that then flow into their behavior and crossing the line into using violence that is unnecessary, i.e. George Floyd. And when I speak to law enforcement groups about veterans coming back into the justice system, I'm always sort of pushing this sort of shadow message along with it that, hey, you all are also subject to a lot of this, and you have a similar culture of denial around post-traumatic stress that the military has had, and it's well past time to recognize it and address it within your own ranks. And I think that that's going to be an ongoing thing that we're going to be seeing for years to come as we talk about how to reform police departments and make them more responsive to the communities that they're serving and protecting. Domestic violence is a very, very commonly committed offense by traumatized veterans. It is unfortunately the loved ones of veterans who are in the closest proximity to them and are most likely to suffer the wrath of untreated trauma. And on that note, I would say that there has been some interesting things happening around the country. Hector Castillo, the veteran, now social worker I mentioned earlier, when he was working on his master's degree in social work, interned at a domestic violence treatment center. This is the place where men who are committing domestic violence are sent by the courts to get treatment as part of their sentence. And Hector recognized the need for veteran-specific domestic violence treatment. And he created a program called Change Step at the Minneapolis Domestic Abuse Project that takes a lot of the programming that they're using in general for domestic abusers, but then adapted it to the military culture and created this program where it is group therapy, bringing veterans together. He said he had run into issues in treating and dealing with groups that contained veterans and non-veterans because, as he said, the non-veterans were afraid of the veterans and would not call them out on their own bullshit, as he put it. And so he started having veteran-only groups where the veterans were more willing to discuss and openly confront each other with their behaviors and belief systems. And it was very successful. Here in the Twin Cities metro area, the Change Step program is a staple for all of the veterans courts. Any veteran with a domestic violence crime, in addition to their VA treatment, is going to the Change Step program as well, and having to participate in that as part of their programming. And I would note that Change Step has been picked up by a number of other jurisdictions across the country, as well as the Marine Corps and the Air Force have adapted Change Step-like programs that Hector created for treating domestic abusers who are still on active duty service. So definitely an area in significant need, and there is some good stuff happening on that front.
I see a couple of questions up here about influence of veterans on current law enforcement. You know, what is the percentage of vets in law enforcement? I see a lot of stuff asking about numbers, and you know, that's one of the things with kind of trying to study the criminal justice system that's been a challenge, especially with trying to study veterans, is that one of the things with data is if you just don't collect it, then you get to claim ignorance. You know, so like one of the things that we were doing a while back was trying to figure out how many veterans are actually incarcerated. And so we sent out freedom of information requests and all this stuff to the different departments, all the different departments of corrections. And I think we got responses from like 20 states or so out of 50. And those that responded, so we published the numbers that we got from the few that did respond, and almost immediately, they fired back. One of the states fired back that said we found they had originally reported to us that they had a 19% incarceration rate. That 19% of their prison population was made up of military veterans, and then that was kind of called out. That was kind of the highest one of our list. Most of them were around 12, 11, different numbers, and this one was 19. And so they immediately kind of came back and released another study that said, no, actually it's 10%. Well, where did you get the 10%? Well, that's what Washington says. We're next to Washington. Okay, so you just kind of took their number and applied it to you. Okay, because you happen to be close geographically. And so like that's been one of the issues with it spills over just the same with law enforcement, trying to study law enforcement. If you try to ask a police department, so how many of your, how many of your officers are military veterans, and that kind of thing. And we don't know. We don't ask that question. It's not on our application, something like that. Or, you can just kind of, well, that's private information. You got to talk to the union for that. It's just kind of give you the runaround. So So that's been one of our challenges lately. Myself, Dr. Bud Brown, and a couple of professors at UNLV are currently kind of collaborating on a book that's focused on demilitarization of police, just because it's becoming we're seeing it as such a big issue in our society with them, the protests and just one, excessive force incident after another. And that's kind of been our conclusion is like, I wonder how many of these people are tied to the military. And even if they're not, that you still got, that now you've got this kind of mixture of cultures in the policing realm, where you've got kind of a paramilitary sort of almost a wannabe sort of thing, where you're surrounded by people who were military, and they still carry a lot of that demeanor and a lot of that culture. And then you've got the civilian officers who maybe haven't been to combat, but now they're still getting influenced by all of that. They're still taking on the tactical pants and the tactical Kevlar helmets and all the, becoming more militarized just by being exposed to that kind of stuff. And it all comes from their experiences in war. It's like, well, this is what we need. Worst case scenario. This is what we need in the worst case scenario. And it comes back, and it all boils down to just being a warrior and forgetting that peacekeeper. I think someone wrote up here about seeing themselves as warriors rather than peacekeepers. There's a sheepdog thing that I see go around a lot. This idea that we're sheepdogs and the civilians are the sheep, and we're the ones protecting them. There's all these wolves out there we have to protect them from, and that kind of thing. And so it's not so much just about maintaining order. No, they've kind of gotten really away from the idea of officer friendly and the polyester suit and that kind of stuff. And so that's definitely where we tie it to is militarization. The longer this war has gone on, and they recruit heavily, as you're getting out. Like for me, when I went through my TAPS program, the Transition Assistance Program, it was a 4-day program where they just had one president tour after another. I think they usually had about 30 minutes to an hour each coming in and pitching their different company. And it was almost all police agencies trying to recruit us, and then a few defense contractors like Raytheon and stuff like that. But it was pretty much just, people trying to recruit us to join their, sort of paramilitary or contractor company. And I saw a whole lot of people I served with do that because it's easy. You go straight from active duty and bam, you go right to the streets as a cop. It's, you can take a lot of that same stuff that you're doing in Iraq and apply it to your policing duties. Like in Iraq, we did SASO, security and stabilization operations. And well, what is that? That's policing. So, but you're doing it with a mindset of, IEDs and machine guns and stuff that just doesn't really exist in our country. And, or at least, on an extremely rare basis, if it does. So anyway, the gist of what I was trying to say was that the data is hard to collect, and that's been an ongoing thing of trying to get it. So that's all I got.
Brock?
I would just tag onto what Kyle's saying as far as lack of data. This is just throughout everything that we're doing researching. There's always like, oh gosh, I wish there was data on that. I saw a question earlier, now I'm not able to find it, but it's a question about whether African-American veterans are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system compared to white veterans. Again, no data that I've come across on that issue. Anecdotally, I would guess that there probably are represented outside of their true numbers for the same reason non-veteran blacks are more heavily represented than whites. They're the victims of a criminal justice system that has been set up to and continues to disproportionately police people of color than whites. And so I suspect that if we did those studies, we would find that there's a disproportionate number of veterans of color in the system as compared to whites as well.
There was a question about non-combat veterans having PTSD, if I understood it correctly. There are veterans who were deployed that were not on the front line, and their stressors, as I've been told, was experiencing being bombed or concerned about being put on the front line. And those are stressors. It's a little different being on the front line than worrying about being called to go on the front line. So they too can be PTSD victims because that is a stressor.
Yeah, I've also just heard enough stories that tell me that there's abuse that happens or something about basic training, things that can happen that traumatize people.
And I would add to that, you know, women veterans and some men as well experience military sexual trauma, whether they ever served overseas or not. And within the veterans court world, a very high percentage of the women veterans that we see coming into the courts, whether they saw combat or not, report being victims of military sexual assaults. And it creates a profound level of trauma that leads to all kinds of self-destructive behaviors that land people in the justice system as well. It's just a really common thing, unfortunately.
Wesley, there's a question here. Are you familiar with in-custody programs for veterans? They use the term barracks behind bars. What can you tell us about special programs that exist behind bars for veterans?
Well, where I was in Soledad, we had a veteran group where all veterans were able to come in and no supervision, just veterans. However, when I was transferred to San Quentin, a gentleman by the name of Ron Self, Marine, created healing veterans while in prison. And I owe my sanity to that program because he too was, today he's at the Veteran Transitional Center creating as a liaison between the center and prison. And he's going into the prisons with his program, Veteran Healing Veterans. And that is a very, very good program. I mean, I could get into the particulars, but yes, there are veterans here in California that have created programs to assist other veterans.
And that segues into this question from Paul Gessler. Where did you get your peer support training?
I got my peer support training from the VA. There was a company that contracted with the VA to get my peer support specialist. I went to the LA VA to get the 6-week crash course to be certified to become a certified mentor for veterans, working with the clinician. Veterans are more open to speak to another veteran, and I would make my notes. And if I'm not, we're a GS6 in the VA system. So we are that piece that will bring the vets and the clinicians together. Because one of the biggest problem is when you have a clinician that has never been to combat, that's working out of a book and a school experience, that creates a problem, especially when you have a veteran that just don't want to be cooperative. And the question always comes up, were you in combat? So why are you sitting here telling me how to correct my behavior? So I believe that was the reason that the peer support specialist, GS6, was established, so we can have a more cohesive relationship with the psychologist or a psychiatrist. As a matter of fact, I participate in a group of veterans, which is comprised of Rangers, SEALs, you know, with Mark Sandman. And he's a psychologist. And as a matter of fact, he's running a program, a CIT program, where we are utilized to assess the peace officers on how to deal with veterans when they pull them over or come in contact with them.
Thank you. Let's peruse the Q&A and give me a signal if you want to speak to any of the questions that you see there. Okay, Brock and then Kyle.
There's a question here about are any of the branches of the military more represented in the criminal justice system than others? Again, no data on this. Anecdotally, I guess, from our experience in our practice and advocacy, it really is about the level of exposure to combat and trauma. And just to quick tie this into another question about whether the military has come around to acknowledge in the reality of post-traumatic stress disorder and ties to criminal behavior. And I would say, yes, they have to some extent, certainly are acknowledging the reality of combat trauma. But there was a study done at Fort Carson, Colorado by the Army in 2009 that studied issues with violent crimes on and around Fort Carson committed by troops coming out of combat in Iraq. And they brought epidemiologists out from Walter Reed Army Hospital, and they did a study on those who were committing violent acts on and around this base and comparing them with those who weren't. And they quickly ruled.
Your sound cut out for some reason. Can we get some technical help here?
Brock, doesn't seem like you're muted. It must be your microphone for some reason. Check
Did
your
your buds die?
Maybe somebody else goes for a while.
Sure, I can talk. I was thinking about, I saw a couple questions on here about post-traumatic growth and PTSD and moral injury. And then, you know, we were talking about policing. And one of the things I was thinking about was this idea of like compassion fatigue. That's one of the things that they've really been looking at with police officers lately. It's not like an official mental health diagnosis yet, but it's something that like Mother Teresa was probably I think the original person who really like made this like an issue, I guess. Like with her, like, you know, she was working with lepers, and she had all these nuns under her working with lepers, and it's really high stress environment kind of thing. And so for her, like, she would make her nuns take off. I think after every like 4 years or so, they would have to take off like a full year sabbatical and go do something completely unrelated to this high stress work environment. And then they could come back and do it again. And that was kind of this idea of that when you work in a field where you're having to be super compassionate all the time and dealing with people in their kind of their worst, at their worst moments, that takes a toll on you. You know, that kind of becomes like its own PTSD. And so like they're looking at that like originally that like, okay, police officers are getting their own sort of PTSD. And so compassion fatigue was like this idea that like, okay, maybe it's not necessarily PTSD, but it's definitely like, you know, the job itself is burning them out. You know, they're getting worn out. You know, I remember watching the and I watched the video of George Floyd, and I saw this officer, doing that terrible thing. And it was like, I just saw a guy who was just completely burnt out. He's just been doing this job way too long, too many hours, just too many bad calls. And just, I mean, I can only imagine all the experience he's had over the years, to get up to that point where he's doing that kind of thing. So I don't know, that's one of the areas I think are interesting and promising, that, we're taking PTSD and realizing that PTSD is actually more of like a conglomeration of a lot of things. And there can be a whole lot of symptoms and a whole lot of different stuff that can fit into there. And so kind of piecing them out and finding out, well, we got moral injury over here, where moral injury is kind of like this idea of violating your own moral code, maybe. Like you go into a war zone and you end up causing some collateral damage on accident, or maybe even a friendly fire incident or something like that, or maybe even did something intentionally while you were there, and now it's weighing on you after you came home. You fired on somebody who wasn't firing on you just to do it, or something like that. Seeing stuff like that. So these kind of things like weigh on their moral conscience and kind of manifest as all kinds of stuff that looks like PTSD when they get back. And one of the things, like when they're looking at treatment for moral injury was like, or PTSD was, like, well, if you got this deep moral stuff, but you're having to like some of the treatment with PTSD will be exposure therapy, where you want you to keep rehashing this stuff over and over so that eventually it doesn't bother you as much. But if it's moral injury, well, the more you rehash that, then that's just going to make you even feel worse and worse and worse the more you do it. And so like the PTSD treatment for someone who's struggling more with a moral injury type issue can make it worse. And then back to the policing stuff with compassion fatigue, like with that, it might just be that, well, they just need to take a break. They just need to go and do something else for a while, go do desk duty, go do something completely unrelated, go do training, get off the street, don't work with the public for a while, and then come back. Just opening up different ideas and different stuff like that is, I think, promising. But I think that's one of the areas where I think we could see in policing, especially with veterans. If you have PTSD, then you go into policing, now you're adding on compassion fatigue on top of the PTSD you brought from war and moral injury stuff if you got that, and in the policing culture, like you can't really go and talk to anybody about mental health stuff. If you get a rating that's too high, now you've become too much of a risk to be out on the streets. Now you're out of job. And so there's kind of this culture that you don't talk about stuff in the policing realm. And so, for them, like, it ends up manifesting in stuff where it comes out kind of on the street or at home. One of the top offenders in domestic violence, is military and police. And it's interesting that the people we have enforcing our domestic violence laws are also the ones who are committing most of the domestic violence. So I don't know. That's all I've got on that. So.
I think I've got my audio stuff sorted out and can finish that answer that question from earlier about the military recognizing ties between combat trauma and criminal behavior. And I was citing to that Fort Carson study. What they ended up concluding in that study is that there was a tie between combat trauma and the violence that they were seeing at Fort Carson. And that the two factors that most correlated to predicting violence was the number of combat deployments individual veterans that they were surveying had experienced, and the intensity of the violence in those deployments. So the more heavily deployed and the more intense the violence that the soldier had participated in, the more likely they were to bring their war home with them and act out against their community. So as far as branches of the service, the Marine Corps, I think, is the smallest force and per capita has more troops directly involved in combat. So I think we see a lot of Marines. We also see, though, a lot of Army infantry and other combat arms as well. And special operations forces also very heavily visible in the criminal justice system that way. The other thing I would throw on to add on to Kyle's discussion about moral injury is one veteran that I have done a lot of work with who also works in the therapeutic field now, helping other veterans. I identifies as suffering from moral injury. Said, you know, that he definitely did things in combat that have haunted him since, and that what he has found is that in helping others, he feels some of the weight of those moral injuries lifting off of his own shoulders. And he said, I try not to be cocky about it, but he says, I know that I have saved the lives of fellow veterans in my therapy and working with them. And he said, when I know that I have saved a life, and I'm very careful not to take credit unless I feel that it really is applicable, he said, I will balance that saved life against the life that I took overseas, and trying to continue to right the karmic scales. And that's something that I found myself thinking about quite a bit.
I think we're running up against the end of our time. It's 11:29. Any last words of wisdom?
I have something that I shared with a SEAL friend of mine who was struggling. I says, we use what we learn and experience in combat to overcome the battle within. That discipline that we learn to follow orders, we need to take charge of our lives and follow the dictates of our heart, which is not what's going on in our heads.
I think I would end just with someone mentioned post-traumatic growth on here, and just that, you know, I wouldn't want to just make it all doom and gloom, that, you know, that everything is, you know, you go to war and you come back and you're just automatically going to end up this violent person and all we can do with you is lock you up and that kind of stuff. That, you know, a lot of people come back and become really amazing success stories. You know, a lot of people come back and are able to get treatment before, you know, they end up engaged in the system at all. You know, so there are a lot of great things. And post-traumatic growth, the idea there, I think, is the idea that you can, you know, take a traumatic experience and use it to kind of grow beyond where you would be had you not had that experience. You know, so like going to war, maybe for me, makes me feel more empathetic and more love for, you know, humanity in general, and more, you know, connection to the world, and more, you know, stuff like that. And you know, that might not be something I would get unless I had participated in war. I might just be another consumer kind of going through the motions and that kind of stuff. So there are some great things that come from it. I think, you know, kind of finding, I think for me, like the key with the Bunker Project, for like my philosophy, I guess, is to try to foster post-traumatic growth in some way. And I think for me, it's that idea of helping someone find purpose and meaning in their life, whatever that is for them, you know, whether, you know, for Wesley, it's mentoring and guiding others on their process out. You know, for me, it's, you know, just trying to research, and it started out just with an internal kind of thing, just trying to figure out, well, how did I go from, you know, Marine patriot guy to, you know, mental patient, like all of a sudden, how did that happen? And so that's what spurred my interest in the research. And now it's all about helping others and trying to, you know, wanting to see other people grow. You know, I mean, being in this house and seeing people, you know, go from, you know, I've had people who go from literally living in a dumpster and doing that kind of stuff and on drugs and just struggling, and then to see them, like, you know, go to school and they graduate and they get a job and, you know, get married and just go become citizens. And that's an amazing thing to see, to be a part of, even if it's just one little, you know, piece guiding them on that journey. So that's all I got.
Yeah, I appreciate that positive message, because I feel even within Veterans for Peace and other peace circles, sometimes there's too much focus. I mean, there's so many, the problems are immense, you know, and it's global issues, you know, and the more you immerse yourself in it, the more weighted down you get. It's like creates its own stress on activists over time. And so I love that term that you threw out, post-traumatic growth, you know, to find the positive, like, okay, we don't want this, but what do we want? You know, expressing those visions and helping people shift into a different way of thinking about the world and about how to solve the world's problems. You know, coming up with solutions and not just focusing on the problems and the evil, you know, they're doing this and they're doing that, and oh my God, you know, reactionary mode. Like, yes, there's an aspect where we need to be doing that, but we also need to attend to our own well-being and help others to grow. Yeah.
I would just throw in one other final positive note, and that is that the advocacy work that we're doing within the criminal justice system to start veterans courts and get the courts to think more about the impact of trauma on the behavior of the veterans that bring them into the criminal justice system, I think poses the opportunity to open the eyes of the entire criminal justice system to the impacts of trauma. And not just on veterans, but on all of the folks coming into the justice system. Many of them have suffered trauma in one form or another that informed their behavior. And so as we are getting jurisdictions that are very heavy law and order to open their eyes and start veterans courts and to do right by veterans, we see that as kind of a foot in the door towards getting those same courts then to open their eyes further to the kinds of trauma and other issues that bring other non-veterans into the justice system, and to consider a restorative justice approach to them as well.
Thank you. And that same principle can be applied to dealing with our homeless population. Thank you all. Thank you, Wesley. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Brock. It's been a pleasure talking with you this morning. And I know from the comments that a lot of the attendees have gotten a lot from your presentation. So
Thank you all for being here.
Gratitude.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.